It was my daughter-in-law's voice that finally broke something open in me. Not her words exactly, I had heard variations of them before, but the tone, flat, bored, like she was telling me the recycling bins had been moved. You need to start living within your means, Lorraine. You're not exactly struggling. I was standing in the kitchen of the house on Maple Ridge Drive, the house my son grew up in, the house where I had hung every Christmas wreath, replaced every broken furnace filter, repainted the front door twice because my daughter-in-law decided she preferred sage green over the original blue. I had done all of it, paid for all of it, and now she was looking at me across the granite countertop, the granite I had paid to have installed 2 years ago as a gift to the house, and telling me I needed to tighten my belt. I said nothing. I poured my coffee. I watched the snow outside the kitchen window settling over the backyard, and I thought about the woman I used to be before I became so useful to everyone. My name is Lorraine. I'm 64 years old. I was born in Sudbury, raised in Ottawa, and I moved to Barrie after I married my husband, Gordon, who passed 11 years ago from a heart attack that came out of nowhere on a Tuesday morning in March. We had 31 years together, Gordon and I. He was a hydro worker. I was a school board administrator. We were not wealthy people, but we were careful people. And by the time he died, we had a paid-off house, a modest RRSP, and a CPP survivor's benefit that kept the lights on without much drama. After Gordon died, I discovered a kind of loneliness I hadn't known existed. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that lives in Tuesday afternoons and Sunday dinners, eaten standing at the kitchen counter, because it feels strange to set the table for one. My son, who I will call my son because that is what he is and what he has always been to me first and everything else second, lived 40 minutes away in Orangeville with his wife, who I will call my daughter-in-law for the same reason. They had 2 daughters. My granddaughters were 4 and 6 at the time Gordon died, and they were the reason I drove that 40-minute stretch of highway more times than I can count. The payments started small, so small I barely registered them as a pattern. First, it was the minivan. My son's transmission had gone, and they were looking at a repair bill that would have cost more than the vehicle was worth. He asked if I could co-sign a loan. Just co-sign, he said. He'd make the payments. I co-signed. For 8 months, he made the payments. Then he called and said they'd hit a tight spot. My daughter-in-law had taken a mat leave that stretched longer than expected, and could I cover 2 months just to help them get steady? I covered 2 months, and then 2 became 4, and the payments became mine in everything but name. That was 11 years ago. Over the 11 years between Gordon's death and the morning my daughter-in-law told me to live within my means, I had paid, in full or in part, for the following: that minivan, which I eventually paid off entirely, a second vehicle for my daughter-in-law when she went back to work, their mortgage gap payments in 3 separate years when interest rates climbed and their renewal hit hard, my granddaughter's hockey registration, equipment, and tournament travel for 6 consecutive seasons, dental work that their insurance didn't cover, a kitchen renovation that my daughter-in-law had wanted since the day they moved in, 2 family vacations to all-inclusive resorts in Cuba and Mexico, which I paid for in full and did not attend because I was not invited, and a long, slow river of monthly transfers that had no specific name but averaged, over the years, somewhere between $800 and $1,200 a month, sent quietly, never discussed, simply expected. I had a spreadsheet. I had always been an organized woman. 30 years in school board administration will do that to you. One evening in February, the one that followed the morning with the sage green kitchen and the comment about my means, I sat down at my desk with a cup of tea and I opened that spreadsheet. I counted everything I had ever transferred, paid, or co-signed for. 112 separate transactions over 11 years. The total was not something I am willing to put into words, even now. I will say only that it was enough to have paid for a very comfortable retirement of my own. Instead, I had been sending it month by month to a household where my daughter-in-law had recently returned from a long weekend in Banff. I knew because she had posted the photos, where she and my son had stayed at a boutique hotel I recognized from travel Instagram accounts. She had tagged the hotel. It had a rooftop hot tub. A room there cost $460 a night. I sat with that spreadsheet for a long time. I didn't cry. I think I had already cried all the tears that belonged to this particular situation across the 11 years it had been quietly building. What I felt instead was a kind of cold clarity, the sort of feeling you get when the fog finally lifts and you realize you've been standing much closer to the edge than you understood. My daughter-in-law was not a cruel woman in the obvious sense. She didn't shout. She didn't name-call. What she did was subtler and, I think, more effective. She managed my access to my own family. She decided when I could visit and for how long. She decided whether the girls were available to talk when I called. She controlled the temperature of the room with a kind of practiced ease that I had spent years trying to warn myself against. I had told myself for most of those 11 years that she was just particular, just private, that my son loved her, and so I should find a way to love her too, or at least make peace with her, and that paying for things was a kind of language she understood as love, even if she never acknowledged it. I had been translating myself into her currency, and she had simply been spending me. The morning after I opened the spreadsheet, I called my sister in Kingston. My sister is 71, practical in the way only an older sister can be, and she listened to everything I said without interrupting, which is the greatest gift she has ever given me. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you want advice?" she said. "Or do you want someone to tell you what you already know?" "Tell me what I already know," I said. "Stop," she said. "Just stop." I did not stop all at once. I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story about a woman who woke up one morning and made a clean, decisive break and everything resolved itself neatly in the following weeks. Real life is not structured like that. I'd been sending money for 11 years, and the architecture of my family had been built around that fact, and I was afraid, I will admit that plainly, afraid of what would happen to the structure when I removed the foundation. What I did first was stop the monthly transfers. No phone call, no explanation. I simply did not send the money in March. My son called on the 12th of the month, which told me exactly how quickly they noticed. He asked if I had forgotten. I said no, I hadn't forgotten. He asked if everything was okay. I said I was fine, just reassessing some things. He was quiet, and then he said okay, and we talked about other things, and I thought perhaps that would be the end of it. My daughter-in-law called 3 days later. Her voice had a different quality than it usually did. Tighter, like something wound just past the point of comfort. She said they'd been counting on that money for the mortgage renewal coming up in April. She said she didn't want to make things awkward, but it would really help if I could be consistent. She used the word consistent, as though I were a weather system she had been relying on for agricultural planning. I told her I was going to need some time to think about my own financial situation. There was a pause. "You have a pension," she said, "and the house is paid off." "Yes," I said. "That's right." Another pause. Longer. "We'd just been counting on you," she said. I said I understood that. I said I was sorry if the change caused difficulty in the short term. I said I hoped they would be okay. I hung up the phone and sat very still for several minutes. Then I called my financial planner, a woman in Barrie I had worked with for 6 years, and I told her I needed to review everything. Every authorization, every linked account, every cosign arrangement still outstanding. I wanted a complete picture, and then I wanted to begin dismantling it quietly and carefully and in the right order. She called back 2 days later. "Lorraine," she said, "I had no idea the scope of this. Neither had I, fully, until I saw it laid out on paper." There were still 3 credit accounts where my name was either primary or co-signed. There was still an automatic transfer authorization my son had on a joint account Gordon and I had opened decades ago, back when my son was in university and needed emergency access. That authorization had never been removed. My son was 41 years old and he still had emergency access to my account, and the emergency had been ongoing for 11 years. I removed the authorization on the Thursday afternoon in April. I closed the joint account the following week. I sent a letter, a real letter, paper, envelope, stamp, to the credit card company requesting removal of my name from 2 of the 3 accounts. The third one was more complicated and took 2 months in a phone call where I had to explain myself to a customer service representative who seemed genuinely puzzled by my situation, but I got it done. 112 transactions. And now, none. My son came to see me in May. He came alone, which told me something, and he sat across from me at the kitchen table, my kitchen table in my house on Maple Ridge Drive, and he looked tired in a way I recognized. Tired the way Gordon used to look when something was weighing on him that he hadn't figured out how to say yet. He said they were struggling. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said the mortgage renewal had been rough and they'd had to pull from their line of credit. I said that sounded stressful. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Mom, I don't understand what happened." I got up and I made us both tea because that is what I do when I need a moment. And when I sat back down, I told him as plainly and gently as I knew how what had happened. I told him about the spreadsheet. Not every number. I did not want to make it a negotiation, but the shape of it. The 11 years, the 112 transactions, the Banff Hotel, the granite countertop, the 2 resorts I had paid for and not been invited to. I told him I loved him. I told him that was not the question. I told him I had made choices over 11 years that had not been good for me, and I had made them because I thought they were good for us. And I had been wrong about that, and I was going to live differently now. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "She told me you offered. Most of it. She said you offered and we just took you up on it." I held my teacup with both hands. I thought about all the phone calls I remembered, all the times my son had asked, gently, carefully, and I had said yes because I was afraid the alternative was losing access to him and to my granddaughters. All the times I had said yes when the honest answer was that I was saying yes because no felt too dangerous. I did say yes, I told him, but I was never asked if I wanted to. He drove home that evening without much else being said. I stood at the front window and watched his car reach the end of the street and turn. Then I went to the kitchen and made myself dinner and ate it at the table, properly set with a cloth napkin, the way I used to eat before I started doing everything standing up and in a hurry because there was always somewhere to be and something to fund. The summer was quiet. My daughter-in-law did not call. My son called occasionally, carefully, and the conversations were short, but they were real in a way they hadn't been in years. My granddaughters started texting me, which they hadn't done much before, little messages about school and their friends, and a video of the younger one's soccer goal that I watched 6 times and saved. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center on Burton Avenue. I had always wanted to try it, had always had a reason not to. I was terrible at it. I loved it completely. In August, I booked a trip to Prince Edward Island. Just myself. A bed and breakfast in Cavendish for 5 nights. And every day I drove the red roads and ate lobster rolls and read 3 novels in a row and fell asleep to the sound of the ocean. I had not taken a vacation alone in 11 years. I had not taken a vacation at all in 4. I cried once, on the second day, sitting on a bench at the edge of a cliff overlooking the Gulf, not from sadness exactly, but from something that felt like grief and relief arriving at the same time, which I have since decided is what it feels like to recover yourself. In October, my son called and asked if we could have dinner. Just us? He came to Barrie, and we went to a restaurant on Dunlop Street that Gordon and I used to go to on anniversaries. And we sat across from each other and ate well and talked for 3 hours without either of us performing anything. He told me his marriage was in a difficult place. He told me he had started to see things differently, looking back. He said there were conversations he and his wife needed to have that they hadn't had yet, and he wasn't sure how they would go. He wasn't asking for my advice, and I didn't offer any. I just listened. That was enough for both of us. He told me he was sorry, not for everything and not precisely enough to tie a bow on it, but the sorry was genuine and I received it as such. I told him I was still his mother. I told him that had never been the part I was questioning. He paid for dinner. I noticed that. I didn't comment on it, but I noticed. The following spring, my daughter-in-law found a part-time accounting position that eventually became full-time. My son picked up additional shifts. I heard these things through my son on our occasional calls, not from her, and I understood that we had arrived at a new arrangement. Civil, distant, functional, and that this was probably the best that would be on offer for some time, and I made my peace with it. My granddaughters came to stay with me for a week in July. Without their parents. First time that had ever happened. We made bannock from a recipe I found online and burned the first batch, and the second batch was perfect. And we ate it with butter and strawberry jam at 10 o'clock in the morning, sitting on the back deck in our pajamas. The younger one fell asleep on the couch watching a nature documentary at 8 in the evening, and the older one and I sat at the kitchen table and played cards until almost 11, and she told me things about her life at school, her friends, a boy she thought might like her, the way she sometimes felt invisible at home. I listened to all of it. I said very little. She looked up at me at one point and said, "Grandma, you're really easy to talk to," and I thought, yes, I suppose I am now, because I am no longer exhausted from giving everything to people who never quite managed to arrive. I did not rebuild my retirement savings overnight. That is the honest truth. 11 years of transfers had cost me something real, something measurable, and a financial planner can lay that out in columns and projections, but no column tells you what it actually costs to spend a decade feeling like a resource rather than a person. What I have now is enough. My pension, my CPP, the house, a watercolor class on Wednesday mornings, lobster rolls in August, a granddaughter who calls me on her own now, without being reminded. 11 years, 112 payments. I closed the folder, and I watched what was built on borrowed foundation decide its own fate without my help. That is the story, and that, as it turns out, was the beginning of mine. There's a version of this story where I stay quiet forever, where I keep sending the money, keep driving the 40 minutes, keep standing at the edge of a family that was built partly on my foundation and never once acknowledged it. I used to think that version was love. I understand now it was something closer to fear wearing love's coat. What changed wasn't a single moment. It was a spreadsheet on a February night and a cup of tea going cold, and a number so large it stopped being abstract. 112 transactions, 11 years. That is what it looks like when a person slowly trades their own life for the approval of people who were never going to give it. I think about what my daughter-in-law said, live within your means, and I don't feel angry about it anymore. I feel something more like gratitude, because she said it plainly enough that I finally heard what had been true for a long time. She had decided what I was for, and I had agreed, quietly, every single month, by showing up and paying and asking nothing in return except to be let in. The hard thing to sit with is that I was not deceived exactly. I was willing. I told myself the story that kept me comfortable, that giving was how I stayed connected, that the money was a kind of bridge, that one day they would understand what I had done and things would be different. That story cost me a retirement's worth of savings in a decade of my own life. The price of a comfortable lie is almost always higher than the price of an uncomfortable truth, and I paid it in full before I understood the exchange. What I know now, and I say this not as a lesson, but as something I learned the slow and expensive way, is that real integrity isn't just about how you treat other people, it's about how honest you're willing to be with yourself. I spent 11 years telling myself a story that let me avoid a conversation I was afraid to have. That wasn't kindness. That was a failure of my own honesty, and the people around me were shaped by it just as much as I was. The clarity I found at that desk in February, the willingness to look at the actual numbers and stop softening them, that took something I had let go quiet over the years. It took being willing to know what I knew, and then it took something harder, acting on it month after month, phone call after phone call, without backing down when it became uncomfortable. My sister in Kingston told me to stop. Stopping is one word. What it actually requires is a kind of steadiness that has to be rebuilt from the inside out, especially when the people you love are the ones asking you not to. Gordon used to say that the most important thing a person can do is show up honestly. Not perfectly, just honestly. I don't think he meant it as advice about money, but it turned out to be the truest thing I carried through all of this. Lorraine, who made Bannock and burned the first batch, is the same. Lorraine, who sat at that desk and finally counted. She always was. It just took 11 years and 112 payments to remember it.